And tonight, as we are gathered together, we are going to be talking about Acts 10 through 15. So there is a lot there. But before we dive into that text, let's start with a word of prayer. Good and gracious God, we give you thanks for the ways in which you move unexpectedly in our lives. Open our hearts, our minds, and all aspects of our lives, that we might be able to know your love, share your love, grow in your love, and be reminded that we are your disciples. It's in Jesus' name that we pray all of these things. Amen. Well, I'm hoping that many of you were able to read through the chapters, and if not, that's perfectly okay. You can simply listen and absorb. I'm just going to go around the room, or kind of down the list here, and my first question to you is, what stood out to you, and what questions were raised for you? So, I'm just going to, normally we start at the top of the list, and tonight we're not going to do that. We're going to start at the bottom of the list. So if you were ever that kid, yes, tonight's your night. Cindy, we're going to start with you, actually.
Okay. I don't have anything particular about a verse.
Okay.
Or that sometimes I've had some comments on that, but this is just in the generic overall reading from verse 1 to where we were tonight.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that has stood out to me and resonated with me is how much we're reading about people who were not the apostles. They were not those disciples. We learned about the 12 ordinary men, but when you read this, you realize how many other disciples, not just them, that were out there doing Jesus' work. And that just has struck me as I read this section while it was talking about, Saul and Paul becoming Paul and Barnabas and just different characters as they named them. And I was just struck by that. It's like the apostles were important, but they were not the only ones out there preaching.
Yep. Yeah, though the book may be called Acts of the Apostles, really, we're hearing more about the people whose lives that they are touching. And I think that's a testimony for all of us. It's not always about us, even though the book may be named after us. Well, thank you very much, Cindy. Mark, we'll come to you next.
Okay.
Any insights?
I think it was the entire portion that we reviewed today was how difficult it was to convince the Jews to accept Gentiles without any, having to become a Jew themselves or follow the old laws. How great that was, and what it took to get Peter even to come around to that point to accept them and to start, basically talking to the other folks within his group to accept them as they were, and to bring them in. So,
most definitely. Yeah. It's a reminder for us, too, of what requirements do we give to others that are trying to understand God and Jesus, and what does it mean to be a Christian even today? Sometimes it's not always about, well, you have to read this book, and then you got to read this book, and then you're on to this book, and now you got to go do this. Sometimes it's just about, come be a part of the community. Great insights, Mark. Thank you. Anything else?
No, I think that was it.
All right. Well, sounds great. Well, next let's go to the Chesvolds.
I learned when people first started calling these guys Christians. I didn't know that before.
Sure.
And this whole thing about circumcision has always struck me as weird. How in the world do these people have to were circumcised, That's weird. And if they weren't circumcised, then they were considered good too.
Very true.
That's about all.
I think what I always like is that story of Peter sleeping and the sheet comes down with all the animals, and God tells him to eat all of them, it's okay. Kind of a symbolic of, you can talk to anybody about this. It doesn't just have to be, just Jews. You can talk to anyone you want. It doesn't matter. And I think that's kind of how we're being told to do the same thing, to accept everybody.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter where they came from or who they are, but to be accepting. And that's what I think Peter had to learn, kind of a hard lesson of that, because that was like really against what he'd heard all his life. So I thought that was kind of an interesting thing, because it was kind of like, you're not supposed to eat this kind of animal. And God said, no, yeah, you're fine. The same thing with talking to Gentiles. That was the same thing. You're fine. It's okay. Go talk to them.
Mm-hmm.
So they could travel all over the place, and God said that was good. So
Yeah.
anyway, I have always liked that little story. So
Sure.
kind of interesting thought. So.
Yeah. Well, it looked like Deborah was agreeing with you in the comments there.
Thanks,
it-
Deborah.
It's also a shift, because we had that distinction of being Jewish and what that means to be set apart and separated from everyone else around them, to now it's, no, I want you to go from being separated to go into the world and be with them. Something sometimes we struggle with, though. How do we do that? In what way can we care and not be changed ourselves? So...
It kind of makes us think that, we have to go out and not just talk to the other Nordics or Europeans, because that's what we end up doing all the time. They have to look like us, and that's totally wrong. So we're supposed to be open to everybody, and that's something that's kind of hard for us to do sometimes, because maybe we weren't brought up in that kind of situation. So I like that. So
growing up... Yeah.
go ahead.
I was just going to say, growing up, I still remember a story of my home church, that evangelism was going from the Danes to the Germans and then going to... So it's just kind of like... So they spoke a different language from you, so that was ministering. And they had it wrong? Or what was it? And so...
It's like having a little town, and there was a Norwegian Lutheran church, a Finnish Lutheran church, a Swedish Lutheran church, and they're all within blocks of each other, but you couldn't be crossing those lines. So,
That's right. That's right.
Not really.
Yeah. No, and it's how do we separate ourselves that sometimes doesn't make sense in God's eyes, that we need to be opening our own eyes to see.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, both of you. Anything else?
That's it, I think.
Okay, great. Shannon, we're going to come to you next.
I'm here to crash
Oh, okay.
and observe. I'm just kind of hanging out, and I thought I haven't been on a Bible study with y'all for a while. But I love Paul. I feel like I identify with him in just my own missionary journey, and I love that he's like, I feel like he's God's wild card that he throws out to the world, because who's this guy who persecuted to now has just a 180 experience, and now because of him we have the New Testament, and I don't know, he inspires me because it's of just how amazing God is, and how you can be so structured and do this, but God is always bigger. God always has a different way, and I like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so Paul's cool. Yeah. So, and I just want to observe and listen to what y'all have to say.
Absolutely. Well, glad you joined us. Yeah, Paul is kind of a central figure in some of these chapters that we're talking about, as are some of the other apostles, as they're making their journey and sharing what Jesus Christ is and does for the world. Sometimes we need to recognize, though, too, the different directions that God is calling each and every one of us.
Yeah, and that's partly why I want to join this, because, I feel like God is calling, I've been out in the world and done the missionary thing, and I've been a part of different denominations, but I do feel like God has, called me here. And so I want to hear more of the Lutheran perspective of things as well.
Sure. Well, we're glad you're here.
Thank you.
All right. Well, next we're going to go to Lorraine.
Okay. I'm going to start out by saying that I found this reading overwhelming. And
Okay.
I don't know. It was a lot. It was just a lot of reading to do. I don't know if it was really that or the fact that my brain is so taxed with this being January, February at work and taking care of the baby as well. But anyway, so it was just a lot.
Sure.
But I thought it was really interesting how in the beginning of chapter 10, how God uses Cornelius. And, they mentioned that he's not one of us. One of the, they point it all out to say, well, he was this, he was that, he was the Roman army officer, and how God used him by sending the angel to have him gather his men to go to Simon's house in Joppa to get Peter to come back with him to, is it Caesarea? Is that how you say it?
Mm-hmm.
And then, and then begin the ministry there with Peter speaking to all of his household and all the people amongst his community. And then, as it goes on, and thank you very much for the map that you showed, because that was really cool. But then Kimball and I were talking about that, and it just, in 2021, it still amazes me that this Bible that we try to model our lives around was written so long ago, and the people made all this happen. We're in this little bitty area.
Yep.
The world is as big as it is, and they were focused in really a very small area, but then of course they were walking everywhere, mostly walking. And it amazes me how it started out so small and just has blossomed so big. That's amazing to me. Kind of like the mustard seed.
Yep.
Anyway, that's it.
No, that's great insight. And I think it's something, too, for us to recognize when we do something good, when we care for someone and even just smile or offer a word of help or, a word of encouragement, how meaningful and impactful that can really be. It doesn't always need to be, I moved the mountain, I built you a house, I did all this. Today, this is what we did together. And that's great. So, yeah, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, Kimball, we're going to come to you next.
Well, I'm going to parrot a little bit of what Mark said, and then Lorraine and I talked about it, so pretty much we have the same opinions. I will start with, and we've talked about this before, Pastor, I would really like to take a book like this one and spend no more than a chapter a week, and probably less, and really dive in to getting a better understanding of what we think is being said.
Sure.
It was overwhelming to me to try to absorb this much, so I'm kind of going to take my overview of things, and it amazes me that with the struggles, with the beliefs that the apostles had, and the interaction with the other people, and the real resistance and give and take of sharing the word and hearing the word in accepting the word, that it grew as quickly as it appears to do in these words.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm very much enthused by the resistance and the interaction that was talked about between the Jews and the Gentiles, because that's human struggle. We want to be with our own kind. We want to do our own thing. And you mentioned earlier about the early churches, the German church. I'm talking about Lutheranism and the Norwegian church. But I kind of think, maybe this is a prejudiced view, but I kind of think that the Lutherans are a little bit more generally accepting of belief from whoever it is and whatever it comes from, as long as they believe. We don't do too much. It has to be this way. We may do it in our mind because we're all human, but I think we're a fairly peaceful religion when it comes to accepting alternative views. And I don't want to cross the line. If it's not a Christian base, it might be a little harder.
Sure.
But even at that, I respect them because they have a belief.
Right.
And it hasn't changed in millennia. And as Lorraine alluded to, what we're doing today with our mission and our evangelism is no different than what Paul did.
True.
The formula has not changed. What's changed is our resistance. We have a strong belief today, but we are weaker in our ability to be willing to share it.
Right.
Share as in not like being accepting, but going out and saying, I'm going to really step out here. Have you been saved? Do you believe in Christ? Or just talking with people.
Yep.
I think we're more resistant. We're more worried about what other people think.
Oh, absolutely.
We killed for our beliefs, and they did.
Mm-hmm.
They were stronger than us.
Well, I'm going to say, depending on the time and the place and the Lutherans that you're referring to at the very beginning, some of us are better at it than others, and some of us are worse at it than others. Some of us don't have that gift or ability. We have to be taught. Remember, many of the disciples, before they went out into the book of Acts, they struggled.
They went to school with Jesus.
That's right. That's right. And I think that's something that we ourselves can recognize. And I think, too, where you were talking about how it is we do share, I do think that there's that we can be too accepting, too. Where we can be too, well, I just want to hear your insight. Well, when do we share what it is we do believe? I'm still reminded of when the youth went down to New Orleans and they helped out some of the families that were impacted by some of the hurricanes. One of the people that was being helped said, there's one thing I love about you Lutherans. You come when it very first happens and you stick around. But one thing you don't do is you don't share with me about God. You don't invite me to church or bring me to that word. And for me, that was like one of those eye-opening experiences of, why don't we? If we're doing this, we're doing that. All it takes is one more word to be said. Why don't we say something? Why don't we do that? We've got a couple of hands that got raised, and so I'm going to call on them in the order that I saw them. I apologize if that's out of order. Lorraine, you were the first one, though.
And the timing couldn't be better by what you just said. So, what I was going to say, I raised my children in the Baptist church.
Mm-hmm.
I help sponsor the mission trips every summer. And those, to me, the youth, are the best evangelists. They evangelize better than, or they, those did. And we were in groups of 100 or more.
Sure.
And I was amazed at the way the kids just so freely and easily would just walk up to a stranger and evangelize to them. It was really neat. So
something some adults could learn too from them, maybe.
yes, absolutely.
All right, thank you, Lorraine. Judy, I saw your hand next.
Well, whenever you got to me, but Kimball brought it up. So, but you were talking about going outside of our comfort zone, so to speak.
Yep.
Talking, evangelizing. But reading this and going through this, it dawned on me that, the apostles and the disciples, they didn't go outside of their Jewish communities right away.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they were very much within their community, which, maybe I'm naive or whatever, but, Jesus didn't say, just go to the Jews and tell them about,
Yep.
talk about, he accepted everybody. So it was really interesting to me to read this, and then when they were talking about the Gentiles coming in, I thought, well, wait a minute. In my mind, they were always talking to everybody.
Sure.
But when I went back, it was like, no, they were only going to the synagogues, and they were within their own groups. Now, within that groups, they had different types of Jews, but it was still, they were just very much within their own community.
Mm-hmm.
Which, to me, was eye-opening, because I kept thinking, well, what? I mean, that was just me being stupid, I guess, or being naive about it. But so, Kimball, I understand what you're saying, but you got to remember that they're just now branching out to other people. They've been within their own groups up until this point.
Sure. Judy, I'll say that it may not be stupidity. It may have been you learned it long time ago, and then now you're relearning it. But I think you brought up some really good things there was kind of a pattern when they did some of their ministry that we ourselves can learn from. They rallied the community around them, the Jewish people, and they would often go to the synagogue first and then to the Gentiles. But they also recognized that there would be some that would listen with ears that were willing to hear, and then there would be others that, no, they weren't ready for it. Shannon, I did see your hand, so I'm coming to you next.
All right. Thank you, Kimball, for saying what you said. I agree with you about why not sharing. And I think in my past, before I really got gung-ho for Jesus, I was more reserved. I didn't want to talk about it, but there were a lot of influences around me, like politics, my family, just people I'm around. And then when I went through my tragedy and I clung to God, and then my own family was like, you're radical, and I was like, what are you talking about? We always say go to the Lord, cling to the Lord,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm like, I'm doing that, so why am I hearing this? And I was really fretting that, and I remember I was like, Lord, am I not doing something right? And in that, he led me to a verse, and I would like to read that to everybody. So if you are in that moment where you feel, hopefully this encourages someone out there who feels like, I want to say something, but then you feel this reservation. And I think sometimes the enemy does that, where he wants you to focus over here. God wants you to focus on Jesus, but the enemy is like, oh, what's the distraction? So the distraction is the worry of what someone else is going to think, and so I want to share this verse, a couple verses. It's in Romans, and Romans 12, 9 through 13. Love in action is the heading. Love must be sincere. Hate what is evil, cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, and faithful in prayer. share with the Lord's people who are in need, and practice hospitality. So we are to have zeal, but I think there's also a balance of, where you are meeting people who are in need and you're meeting them where they're at. And so I just thought that tied in nicely with what you said, and I hope that verse speaks to someone tonight, as it did for me.
Yeah. I think that echoes greatly what we were just talking about. That's great. Thank you for sharing.
You're welcome. And again, that was Romans 12, 9 through 13.
9 through 13? Okay. Susan, I'll come to you next. Or Dave, whoever raised their hand.
It was me, because I was thinking about when we were saying, somebody said something about that we didn't really go off and do anything as Lutherans. However, in the 60s and 50s and whatever, they had so many missionaries that went to Africa that there are no more African Lutherans than there are any Lutherans anywhere else. And I thought they must have done something right, and we weren't so afraid of it at one point. So I just think that's so interesting that because there are more African Lutherans than Europeans or anybody else, I think that's really interesting, because we're not always so sitting in our little churches and staying away. So I remember seeing a lot of those missionaries as a kid when you went to Bible camp, or they came to our churches, and they always had something to tell us. We learned Swahili, a couple words which I don't remember, but it was always interesting. In fact, one of our pastors when I was a kid had been a missionary in China, and he had to leave suddenly because of the communists taking over, and he barely got out, which is a really interesting story. I never thought about it much when I was a teenager. I mean, like, whatever. But it's an interesting thing, because we were everywhere at one point. So I just think that's interesting. So.
No, and I think that's one of those areas where we need to go back to our past and say, what is it we did right during that time that we could repeat, that we could resurrect even today? And it may not be overseas. It may be in our own neighborhoods where we need to go out and minister and be missionaries. I think that's one of the things that churches need to be reminded of, is each one of our churches is a mission post where we can go out, share the word, do God's work, and be that place where the world will know of Christ's love. I think that's a great reminder, and we might need to go back to our 50s and 60s roots. All right. Well, we got a little bit of a tangent, but that's not all bad. Sometimes we do our best growth as we're diving in deep. I'm going to keep us moving along. Judy, we are coming to you next.
Well, I think everybody's pretty much talked about everything that, brought up that, other than the Gentiles, and now we're moving forward. There was a lot in this. I'm kind of like Kimball. It would be nice to take a chapter at a time and really dive in, especially now that they're spreading out. There were so many names of people and places. And in my Bible, I have, the back where they have maps and stuff. Thank the Lord for that. But then, I'm online trying to figure out who some of these people are and what they were, and some of it is just what it says in the Bible. They don't know. They're just names. So it was just interesting. There's just a lot going on at this time, and it's the spreading out of and how far they're going, and they keep going back. They go back to Jerusalem, and then it's kind of like they go back, and then they go back out, and then they come back, and they go back out. So it's just interesting.
Sure. Yes, Kimball. Oh, you got to unmute yourself first.
I learned something, though. They don't go back to Jerusalem. They go up to Jerusalem.
Oh, yes. That was the one thing.
No matter what direction you're going up when you go to Jerusalem.
I know, exactly.
Yep.
I saw that. I wrote that down as a matter of fact. So it's like, okay, everything's going up to Jerusalem. I don't care where you are, but you're going up to Jerusalem.
No, and I think when I was trying to plan this out of how quickly we go through these chapters, it was which ones can kind of group together. And in history, there's some of the names that we do have, but there's not a lot on the people. That there is something we can kind of learn from, but I think there is some value there too in maybe taking some time and saying, okay, what was actually happening here in chapter 12? Do we know about X, Y, or Z, or is it just an unknown?
I think some of that too for me is I'm really curious as to Agabus, I can't, anyway, he was the helper, the guy who was helping Claudius. So I had to go and see what years those were. And what else, my curiosity is what else is going on in the world outside of it. I mean, we're talking about this right here, which is great.
Sure.
But what else was going on that was influencing maybe some of this stuff?
Gotcha.
I didn't write down the check. Anyway, he was a prophet that predicted the famine during Claudius's reign, which was 41 to 54 AD. So I can't remember where it was. I was going through, and then I started writing in my Bible again, and then I got back. So anyway, it's just like I said, there's just a lot going on, and it would be curious to know what else was going on outside of this area with it, because the people were still trading back and forth, and what was going on in Rome, and who, and all that stuff. So it'd be interesting, which influences a lot of what's going to probably end up happening later on in this. So
sure. Agabus is in 11:28. Okay. Chapter 11, verse 28. I guess I don't know how much of a tangent you want to go on as to what else is going on.
I was just saying that if we ever, it would be nice to, in some of this stuff, to know what's going on outside of this.
Sure.
So that's probably a whole another Bible study. So it's not this. I know we're going through this, but that's just my curiosity more than anything.
No, and I'll just invite you that if you ever do have any of those kind of questions, like as you're reading through it and just saying, okay, we need to slow down, ask some questions, send me an email. And if anything, maybe we just adjust the schedule on some of this too. If we all kind of are, let's slow down on some of this because there's a lot going on here.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I get it. We're doing doing what the apostles were.
Yep.
Setting up, and I get that. It's just that sometimes it's I need to put it in perspective of other things going on in the world.
No, absolutely. Here again, it depends on where the focus is, because if we're talking about what's going on in Jerusalem, that has an impact on some of the church, but also then what's going on in Rome, how it is Rome is expanding in some areas and how it's trying to take its armies into this, but that means it's drawing more taxes on their colonies.
That's kind of what I'm saying. I mean, there's other things that are influencing a lot of because you read something and you go, huh. Mm-hmm. You don't know you don't know where that's coming from.
Right. I think that's one of the reasons, though, that especially with Agabus is actually talked about, is that it wasn't everything was coming from Jerusalem, but God was speaking out into even the small groups, and they were able to share what wealth they did have back to Jerusalem, back to other churches, and it wasn't just, well, we're fine over here on our boat, you guys are over there doing your thing. There was a connection. There was some working together between a church over here, a church over there, and it's how it is we can support each other. So
yeah, like I said, there's just a lot going on, so.
Yeah.
That's all.
All right, so just basically a history lesson in the 40s is really what you're looking for, right?
40s, 50s, and moving on.
Yeah. Okay. I want to make sure we get around to everyone. I can do a little bit of a history lesson on the 40s, 50s, and 60s here. Let's go around to the last few people, and then maybe we can finish up with some of that then. So, keep us moving, the Lundgrens. We're going to come to you next.
Okay. Well, I always like to look at the Bible studies from the perspective of the 21st century.
Sure.
And I was noticing in chapter 15:29 that they laid out some requirements for Gentile believers.
Mm-hmm.
The first was that you don't eat food sacrificed to idols.
Yes.
And I was thinking that's really not a temptation for many people in the 21st century. The second requirement was you don't eat blood. And unless you're British and you like blood pudding, there's not very many dishes that I know of that have a lot of blood in it, unless, well, I guess rare, meats sometimes have blood associated with it.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have, you don't eat meat that from strangled animals.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not typically a way that butchers used to kill the animals. When we were down in South America, we ate some guinea pigs that had been strangled.
Yep.
And that was an interesting experience. Now, the last one is a bit more problematic in the 21st century. You get down to sexual immorality,
mm-hmm.
and there's a major industry
Yep.
that contributes to that.
Mm-hmm.
And so it depends on how you define it, I guess. But they don't usually spend a lot of time limiting people's access to the church by what they're doing in their free time and that sort of thing.
That's a good way to put it. I think one of the things that they were really striving to do there is give some guidance as to what does it mean to be a Christian. And in many regards, the sacrifice to idols, the meats that were there, would have been very prominent. Like every other block would have been a temple where there would have been sacrifices and food was readily available, much like our fast food chains are here today. And so to keep that into context, along with that though too, the types of meat and foods that were offered there. And some of this has to do with hygiene, and some of it has to do with, I'll say the types of food that were used at the right temples or the different temples. Because some of the food that was being given or shared was particular foods that would have been deemed by the Jewish people as a non-kosher, but perfectly acceptable for the Gentile people. However, it would also have been given as a sacrifice for certain deities and considered a delicacy, or it was an animal that was as closely associated with a deity. And so there was also a distinction there that's being made. When you brought up gerbils, or guinea pigs, as being strangled and then consumed, rodents were one of those animals that was not deemed as an appropriate meat because of its hygiene, because of fleas, because of other diseases and other things that would often be associated with it. And so it was also a regulation of how do you have a good, prosperous life, free from many of the things that are holding you back or can lead you astray. The fornication also had to do, not necessarily in our terms, but oftentimes at some of the temples, there would be temple prostitutes. And so some of that fornication then too was going and being a part of some of those ritual practices that were being done at these other temples. And so it was really that distinction between what separates us from following God and we're not like the other people around us. So it's good that you're making some of those 21st century distinctions, but it's also, how does that translate from their time to our time? Great insights, though, Jim. Anything else? Cheryl?
Well, I found chapter 10 to be the most interesting in this reading, with Cornelius and Peter.
Mm-hmm.
With Peter, he has a vision
Mm-hmm.
of the different animals that it's okay to eat those. He's gotten God's permission, so to say, to eat these different animals. But also what was most interesting was how he applied that down in chapter verse 28. But God had shown him that I must not consider any person ritually unclean or defiled.
Mm-hmm.
And that is why he was willing to go down to see Cornelius.
Yeah.
So it's an application.
Sometimes we need a good, powerful dream in order to get us motivated and to say it's okay to go and do this. I wish that sometimes we got those dreams more often or more clear. Great insights. Anything else from either one of you?
No.
No? Okay. Deborah, are you able to join us, or do you want to share yours via chat? Let's see. When we get to Acts chapter 15, 19, I need to have the term "and from blood" explained. Okay. So the blood was... I'm trying to think of a way in which it would be used. Blood pudding was a way in which blood was used. Oftentimes it was also used for sausages, and the blood of an animal would also be used to boil some kind of meats. And for any of you who have ever had like a blood sausage or anything like that, it may not be your favorite. For others, it may be a wonderful delicacy that they're longing for. It reminds them of home. However, in doing so, the blood itself was often referred to or regarded as the life force of God, the very life energy that really flowed through our veins that gave us life. And so it was often regarded as the medium in which God was moving through a person or an animal that is breathing. And so it was often considered sacred. It was often regarded as holy and special. It's one of the reasons that the blood was used as part of the sacrifice. It would be poured upon the altar and it would be risen up as part of the sacrifice at the Holy Temple. There are other groups, though, that would use a blood sacrifice in order for their own deities as well. It was not uniquely an idea of the Jewish people. This was something that was, I'll just say, echoed throughout the cultures of the Norwegian, the Vikings, to African cultures, to Indian, to many parts of the world. But it was also seen as a thing that was not meant for humankind. And if you did partake in that, then you would be... I don't want to say blaspheming, but you would be defiling it in some regards. That it should really be offered to God, or it should be returned to the earth. In that regards. Hopefully that answered your question, Deborah. Yes. All right. Any other questions, thoughts, or other things that may have come up as everyone was talking? Well, seeing none, Judy, I'm going to go back just a little bit, and we've got just a few minutes here that I want to spend a little bit of time in what's going else on in the world around them. One of the biggest things that I think people need to be reminded of, especially during this time, is yes, people were not able to travel very fast, However, people were able to travel, and quite frequently. Jerusalem in and of itself was a trade route city. There were people that were traveling from the east, from the west, from Africa, from the south and to the north, and they were going through this because it was a land-based area that they could very easily travel. However, from the shore, they could also then go by boat to practically anywhere. So when Peter and others are traveling, it could be by caravan on the roads, and so they were riding with animals and other travelers that were bringing goods from one region to another. It could also be by shipping merchants. So they could very easily be going from Jerusalem or Caesarea onto Turkey or even Rome, as we'll read later on, that they really are able to move about. But it will take a few days, even a week, for them to travel some of that distance. As they did, they also then had that opportunity to not only share what was going on, but they would also have an ability to listen. I'm going to remind you, when you were able to travel by air, what is the one thing you often dreaded or loved to do? Sit next to someone on the airplane and say, "So, what do you do for a living?" And as a clergy, it was something you always hesitated and said, do I tell them that I'm a pastor? Because then I know the conversation is going to go around church. It's going to go around this. It's going to be a confession of what's going on in your life, or it's going to go down that path. Do I want to do that or not? For Paul, he embraced it. He was probably the man who would sit next to you on the plane and say, "So I'm a pastor. What's your faith all about?" And I think that's something to recognize, because God does place us in opportunities in which they were able to share their faith, but they also got into that mindset. They got into that ability. So as they were traveling for a few days or even a week on the boat or on this caravan, they would sit down and actually have some of those conversations and know it's part of their ministry. This was something that they often did from church to church, from community to community. I think we often recognize, though, that this was a people who didn't have the automobile, who didn't have an airplane, and so they were really landlocked. Maybe they only traveled 12 miles in their whole life. Well, yeah, that's possible, but as we see, Paul probably travels hundreds or thousands of miles in his whole lifetime. And he travels and does this ministry, this mission, because he feels that calling. I tell you all of that because it's important to note that they are actually interacting with a lot of cultures. They're interacting with people from different kingdoms, from different languages, and oftentimes they had to speak several different languages and one common language, Greek or Latin, in order to almost be a business language. That it would be a common language that anyone would speak in order to make a deal, in order to make a trade in whatever it may be. Goods, wealth, even animals or people themselves. It's something for us to be reminded of. Now, the other aspect here is during this time that we're talking about, we're really talking about probably 35 AD or BCE, depending on how you want to number this, to really about 70 AD or BCE. That we'll be talking about all of these different travels, all of these different interactions and people that are going on. It's during this time that the Roman Empire is still expanding. And they're trying to go west into Spain. They're going south into Africa. They're still pushing east past Jerusalem and trying to make their way closer to India. And they're also haven't even gone north yet. At this time, they're probably in northern Italy and don't go much further. They're maybe in the southern parts of France. And so there's there's still some expansion in which they're trying to get more wealth, more security for their supply lines that are going around. But as they're doing that, they're also building infrastructure. They're bringing in roads that are more durable for goods to be traveling. They're bringing in that infrastructure of water, of sewage, and all of those different aspects. The other problem there, though, too, then, is they're wanting taxes. And for those of us who love April 15th, which I don't know who many people do, but we always talk about, well, what are these taxes going to be used for? Oftentimes, it wasn't even staying in your own country or your own nation. It might not even be helping you. It's going to expand the Roman Empire. At the same time as well, we have those cultures that are coming around with different gods, having the dominant religions around where they are worshiping the Roman gods. Think of your mythology studies of college or other times in your life when you've kind of studied Zeus or Hermes or Aphrodite and Ares and all of those kind of things. So keep in mind that's really your dominant religion. The Jewish people were regarded as a group, though, that could still hold their religion and not have to worship the Roman gods. This came around because of their defiant and way in which they rebelled against the Romans. That when they were being overtaken, the Jewish people were willing to say, I'm willing to die, and it's until the very last one of us that you will have to kill us. Then you will be able to take our land. And it was this determination, this fierce desire for being a community and willing to give everything that they had to their Lord and their faith, that actually the Romans were saying, I don't know if we can overcome this. I don't know if we can take this truly over. And so they actually entered into this agreement where you can have your faith. You do not need to regard this. However, you will need to pay higher taxes. And so they were willing to do that. It's a recognition, though, because the Jews then were seen as separate and different from everyone else. And whenever you have that, whenever you have a people that are isolated or separate, others become jealous. Others see the abilities that they're given, and they're saying, how come they got that special treatment? Why can't we have that too? And so there's that animosity, almost a hatred that goes against the Jews, even at this time. At the same time, too, it also speaks directly to the Christians that are forming their own communities. Because they were wrestling with, in this very chapters, what does it mean to be Christian? How do you need to be a Christian? Are you Jewish in your practices, in your traditions, in your way that you're living your life, so that you will get that special exception, so that you will be separated from the Roman influence? Or is God calling us to do something new, be something new? But then, how are you different? And will you be regarded then as that different group? Will you be given the same special treatments as the Jews? Or will you now have to now also worship at the temples? Yet they're making it clear you can't. There is going to be a lot of unanswered questions. And it's not going to be answered in the book of Acts. It's not going to be answered in much of the New Testament. In fact, it won't be finally answered until around 300 or so. And that's when Christianity becomes the official or dominant religion of the Roman Empire. And then even then, it becomes a stumbling block of what it is this means, how it is this comes around, what are the defining points of Christianity. And that's when we have our Apostles' Creed, our Nicene Creed, Athanasian creeds really come around. The canonization of the whole scriptures, of what it is we have in there or what it is we don't have in there. It's also here in the 35 through 70 time that we have this still growing struggle among the Jewish people as to this anger or even hatred or despise of the Romans, where we have still some of those groups that are wanting to rebel, kind of like some of the Zealots or others that wanted to start that riot or insurrection against the Romans and remove them, and be like the Maccabees, where they would remove them from the nation and restore the right religion once again and be in power. We still have that growing, and that will be towards the end of Acts. We'll see some of that, where the Romans will actually come in and destroy the second temple. So all of these things are unfolding or haven't unfolded yet that we need to be aware of. Some of the other interactions, though, that are going on is they're going further south into Africa. They're going further east and encountering other languages, other religions and cultures. And how do you interact with that? How do you help people, not necessarily like the Romans or the other Gentiles, the Hellenists who can speak, but how do you talk to someone who is outside of your ability to talk? We had this even in some of our last chapters where Philip was talking to the Ethiopian. We had some interactions with some of those African nations that were now starting to do business, starting to make trades, but now the religion was starting to go that direction. What does this mean? What's holding it back and what's separating? There becomes a question then of what is holding back the faith and how do we keep it spurning on? How direct can we send people to those different regions but still have them be supported, still being cared for, still keeping them without going into false teachings, but still keeping them in some regards in some teaching, in some agreed upon message. This was kind of still in the works during much of this time of what does it mean to be a new Christian? What does it mean to be a Christian? And we're still wrestling with that in these chapters. I'm trying to remember what else is going on. We still have a Roman emperor and I'll say a republic or senate going on in Rome itself. But even that is, I'd have to go back and really do some more reading in some books to see when that, because that does break down the Senate and the emperor, kind of who's actually in control, who has authority. There's a book that I would really want us to kind of dive into for some of this. It's The Rise of Christianity by Rodney Stark. And it has a really good, clear reading of what was it like during this time from, I believe he starts 100 or 200 before Christ and going on up until about 500, I think is when he ends. And that's The Rise of Christianity by Rodney Stark. That would be another one, I think, for us to do a Bible study on, to really kind of branch out even after this, to get some history of what's going on in the world, and then coming back to this maybe again and saying, what are our connections? Where are we reading some of this? But he definitely writes as an outsider, as a Hellenist or a Gentile view of the world. He's not writing it from a Christian or even Jewish perspective. So I'll say that's as much as I can come up with off the top of my head, and our time is kind of up, so I kind of need to wrap that up too. I'll just ask one question. Is something like that helpful? Was that something that if I were to add some of that into the video that I kind of share beforehand, would that be good? And that way we could talk more about it here? I'm seeing some thumbs up and some heads, yeah? Okay. I will definitely see about adding some of that then to that video that I try and put out every week too before this. Yes, Miss Lorraine, you raised your hand.
How about if it was on a timeline? If you could somehow draw it out on a timeline with the dates.
Sure.
Maybe, I don't know.
Yes, I can do that. I'm going to have to think about how. And I might ask some others to help me with some of the graphic design of it. Shannon, I'm looking in your direction. So, Kimball, you had your hand raised?
I'm going to be very careful because it's very easy for us to say, yes, we want that. And you only have a limited number of minutes every week. But I think what I heard from Judy, and if not, Judy, forgive me, but for me anyway, I would like to see two things. An in-depth Bible study that we've talked about, and what I'm kind of seeing the concept here, I'd like to see this concept more like a historian perspective, where we have the book and the words, but what is happening around it.
Okay.
As well as right in the middle of it, not in the middle per se with the apostles, but the day-to-day life. What is it like?
Okay.
So we can live it. Kind of like what The Chosen has been doing.
Yeah.
Immersion, into all of it.
Sure.
It might, just a bit.
No, this is where I'm trying to think through. There's no one book that does that I have been able to find. There are collections of books, but I'm also hesitant to say, we're going to read these 15 books together and we're going to do it one chapter at a time, and this week we're going to be on this, and it'll take us 5 years to get through them all. Yeah. Or Kimball, you want to do that. All right.
NT Wright. I think it was an Acts or a New Testament study with him, and he has a book. He's a little too academic for me. But if that's your thing, then he would be a really good, and so you don't have to reinvent the whole thing.